Hi, this is Robert with CRUZBIKE, and we have installed our awesome rear rack and underseat rack. Now we're going to install fenders, just in case it rains, on our 2021 S40. Here I have a set of 700C Planet Bike Cascadia fenders. I like any of the fenders that have the struts that are adjustable in and out at the fender work best. Wraparound style struts are less effective. For this, we're going to need a 10mm nut driver, and we'll also be using our 4mm Allen for the bolts. Now, a little caveat before we begin is fenders are always going to take a little bit of MacGyver work, either on our mounting locations here on the dropout or at the bridges for the rear. Also, we have our mounts on the front fork on the left side. The right side mount looks a little differently. That's because the one on the right side is a welded insert in the hollow part of the fork. The one on the left is a threaded tap right in the dropout itself of the brake. So let's start with the front brake. So I like to mount the brake with the tab to the front of the fork. So you can certainly remove the wheels to do this. I just bend the tab down, slide it up underneath the crown very carefully, and then I'm going to mount it to the front of the crown. Again, remembering that any fender set you use is going to require a little bit of fiddling and bending of the mounts and the struts. We'll get more on that later. So here we're going to install one of our long bolts that came with the fender set, along with a couple washers and also a nylock nut on the other side, and we'll tighten that down to the crown. Now these fenders are, I believe, 40mm in width, and they fit nicely above the tire. The new tires on the 2021 S40 are a 32C width, and the revised crown allows a standard fender to fit between the tire very nicely. So now that we have attached our top mount to the fork, we're going to work on the struts. And we'll loosen those with a 10mm nut driver. And now any fender that you install, it might have two struts. Some front fenders just have one strut. This one has two. So what we're going to need to do is remove the struts from the fender. We're going to loosen them up just a little bit here, just so we can slide them out of the attachment. We're going to line up the mount hole, and we're going to find out where we need to bend the strut. So the back one looks pretty good. The front one needs to be bent at some point along the strut, so then it lines up with the hole for the fender strut itself. So we're going to give it a little bit of a bend, kind of line everything up, kind of eyeball it. Note our struts are very long, so we're going to mark that with a Sharpie, and then we're going to use our bolt cutters or hacksaw or whatever tool you have to cut those struts just like this. And once the struts are cut, we can insert those back into the fender mounts. And once everything's nice and inserted, then we can use our M5 bolt and thread it into the strut. Now note the threads on these front mounts are not super deep, so most of the hardware that comes with a set of fenders will work. If not, you might need to source some other stainless metric M5 bolts of a different length. It's going to depend largely on the fenders you buy and the length of hardware they include. So once we have that installed, we can repeat for the other side. Now both sides on this particular bike should have nearly the identical bend, since the mount holes are in about the same position on the fork. So once we have both of our struts bent and installed, then we will be able to put enough space at the top of the fender for the tire, and then tighten the top of the struts with our 10mm nut driver. Alright, and there we have our front fender fully installed. I'm going to check and make sure we don't have anything hitting the tire. Our spacing is nice and even. Now, like with all fender installations, we're going to take a look at our good work, and then we're going to have to prepare ourselves to do the rear fender install. Now, personally, when installing fenders, there's always a little bit of work involved, like I mentioned before. Take yourself a moment, have a donut, have a cup of coffee. Installing fenders is always a little bit of a challenge. Know that we're here though. If you need help or you have questions, you can always get a hold of us. I'll usually be having some donuts and coffee myself. Okay, break time's over. Let's install this rear fender. What do you say? Okay, this particular fender brand comes with a nice plastic clip that we can attach right to the back of the fender. This clips right on. Now, for this particular fender, we're going to install the fender first over the tire, and then we're going to use our little bracket. You can install it usually on the lower bridge. The nice thing about this particular fender set is we can position it anywhere on the fender we want. Now, unlike an upright bike, the stays on a cruise bike are higher off the ground, so you're usually not going to be installing the fender using the lower mount that you find on the front part of the rear fender. So we're just going to use our nuts and bolts. We're using the hardware that came with the fender set to install this bracket on the lower bridge. Now, because this fender has two sets of struts, There's really no reason for us to have another bracket on the upper bridge in this particular case. So we're going to space this away from the tire just like we did for the front and attach that. Now we have a nice solid point for that. A little bit of a pro tip: if you experience the fenders moving back and forth in that bracket, you can install a piece of double-sided tape between the bracket and the fender and it'll stay in place. Now we'll use our 10mm nut driver, just like we did on the front, to loosen our struts. And then we are going to do the same thing, line up the holes and figure out where we need to bend our struts. Now, these struts are just long enough to reach, so take a note of where that strut needs to be bent. We're not going to have to cut the rear one at all because it's just barely long enough to begin with. The middle one we have a little bit extra, so we don't necessarily need to cut it if we don't want to. As always, we have a little bit of a gap we need to clear for the brake. This is very common on just about any bike that you find, especially in the rear. So for this, we're going to use a small spacer that we have. A lot of fender sets will come with spacers. You can always cut those down, or I always recommend finding a spacer at a local hardware store, or perhaps you can use a small stack of washers as well. And once we have those, then we can install the lower bolt for the rear strut. Okay, so we've prepared our rear strut finally here, and we're going to be using the mount hole there. We have our proper length bolt and a small spacer, so everything clears. And then just like the front, we can install our struts back into the fender itself, and then we can attach the strut to the frame. We're going to use our 4mm Allen to tighten these bolts down. Make sure they're nice and snug. Now notice we have good clearance from the brake. We want to make sure that the strut is not rubbing against the brake. Now here I've cut the strut down a little bit, and I used a set of small bolt cutters to do that. We don't need to cut the back one. Now once again, we can do the same repeat for the other side. Make sure everything is the same. Because our mounting locations are identical on either side of the CRUZBIKE, the bend in the struts will be pretty much identical. Now on this side, you can use a spacer so it matches the other side, but you don't have to. Sometimes having a spacer on both sides makes centering the fender over the tire easier, but in this case we're just going to mount it straight to the dropout. Now here again, just so we can match the other side, I'm going to use my little bolt cutters. Make sure you watch your eyes if you use that. Trimming that stay and then putting our cap back on it, make it look nice and clean. And then just like we did for the front, we're going to lift it a little bit to clear the tire and then tighten our 10mm nuts down with our nut driver. Now on this particular Fender set, again, the back strut is just long enough to reach, so we're just going to insert this in there. It gives us just enough clearance, and then we can tighten those down with our 10mm nut driver. Now the adjustment of these struts is why I like this style of Fender the most, because it gives us the longest opportunity. If you have Fenders with the wraparound style, they're not likely going to be long enough to reach the mounting holes. This is pretty common for a lot of bikes because those Fenders are usually designed for a very specific type of dropout that has a much closer mounting point, usually right at the rear wrap. But ours is a little bit in front of that, so we're going to use these style. We have good clearance here, make sure nothing is hitting. And that's it. Our Fenders are installed, ready for any type of storm that might come your way, or if anything, just to keep your bike nice and clean when you ride and hit a dusty patch. As always, if you have any questions, please contact us at support@cruzbike.com, and as always, happy cruise biking.
The only thing technically I can do is cut this guy down. Because like you said, this is